Thank you so much. And can I say what a great honor and privilege it is to be here today? This is my third Making Futures. I can barely believe it as I say it. And I'm not lying because Malcolm's in the room. This is truly my most favorite conference in the whole wide world. It's the only one I enjoy every session and don't want to fall asleep. So I'm obviously following a hard act, like what incredible work and so much to think about. So I'm hoping you guys will be patient with me and let me take you through my journey. So today I'll be talking to you. I don't know if the slides are up. Oh, okay. Do I just click through? Just this? Okay, great, it's up. So today I'm going to be talking to you today about, well, craft and using craft to foster inclusive futures and leadership solutions for makers in Pakistan. Um, so most of you would agree that supporting the development of artisanal and traditional crafts presents a unique opportunity for both livelihoods generation and changing the perceptions about the capacities of some of the most marginalized people, particularly in the context, I will be speaking obviously about Pakistan, but in the context of Pakistani society, changing people's perceptions about what the poorest youth and women can do. Pakistan is a Muslim country. You all know this. We are often in the news for all the wrong reasons. Our PR agency needs to be fired yesterday, but we're very different for what people imagine, and there's a lot of scope and potential, and I'm hoping at the end of this hour you will all have changed your mind both about the country and particularly about its women. Yeah, I didn't break that, did I? No. Okay. So Pakistani craft, and the reason why I'm talking particularly about Pakistani craft today is that I sincerely believe that it has all the elements required for a strong global brand. This includes a unique competitive advantage, including heritage, scarcity, artistry, empowerment, and of course, skilled craftsmanship. I particularly mentioned this, and I think it's interesting that I'm going to lead with this statistic just after this other presentation, but the global craft market does stand at today at 560 billion US dollars. And it is estimated that it will cross 1 trillion by 2023. What is Pakistan's share of this economy? Negligible and not documented. But basically, it is a missed opportunity for a country where poverty and unemployment are serious issues. And so I hope today to talk about why, despite this massive global demand, rural female producers in the country are unable to benefit from international commerce, as converting the skills of traditional artisan communities into modern products that can compete in mainstream market requires significant investment, patience, and expertise. Okay, what am I supposed to be pointing at? Sorry. I'm going. Where do I point? Where do I point? Does that work? Yes, okay. Got it. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context because I recognize that not everybody knows much about Pakistan. So I'm going to be good, as I always am in all my Making Futures presentations, and stick with official statistics and not my own theories about them. All right, this does not like me. Ah, there we go. Poverty. So according to the Pakistan Economic Survey 2018, 1/4 of the population lives below the poverty line. 40% experience what is known as multidimensional poverty. Women constitute 48% of our population. I mean, that's a statistic that before getting on the plane, I was on a International Women's Day is approaching. There's massive corporate takeover of that event. So I was at a large corporate event talking about rights and women's leadership in corporate sector. And it was really interesting because one of the speakers talked about the figure 48% of the population and how that's actually a very disturbing statistic because usually, women tend to be a slightly higher proportion of the population, and the fact that they're less than 50% in Pakistan indicates, well, some degree of femicide, but also a large degree of discrimination when they're young. So many women, small children, which are female children, don't make it past 5. But also, those of them that do make it, we experience 51% female illiteracy. And I should clarify that in our country, literacy means the ability to sign your name. So, or I should clarify, read the Quran. And when I say read the Quran, that means literally just read Arabic without necessarily understanding a word that you've read, because Arabic is not our native tongue. So we learn to read it, but we don't understand a word of what we read. So that's literacy in the Pakistani context. But 51% of women are illiterate. According to the World Economic Forum, Pakistan ranks second last out of 153 countries on gender parity. So yeah, not looking so great so far. Instability, and I mean, this is why Pakistan is famous, right? That's our MO. We are politically unstable. We have internal strife, and what's the word? Terrorism. We've all heard it, right? So we're not looking so good so far. And I think one of the reasons I particularly talk about my work is that female labor force participation in the country is at 25%, which is the lowest in the South Asian region. So despite the fact that this, yeah, okay. So women face significant barriers and constraints which impact their ability to benefit from productive and economic activity. Rural women are further marginalized by limited mobility, feudal and tribal customs, and difficult living conditions. So embracing these communities' handicraft practices can provide an opportunity to portray believe me, this is not corona, it's just allergies. No, not corona, their experiences, their voices, and create cohesion and value for people facing barriers in joining the formal workforce. So in our line of work, we believe that supporting small craft-based businesses can be a means of empowerment and inclusiveness while also preserving age-old artisan skills. So it is both a social and economic opportunity. So as I said earlier, most women in Pakistan are homebound, which means they get to never leave their homes. Those who can leave their homes cannot leave their communities or villages. They have little or no control over household income, insignificant access to credit, and very limited asset ownership. They're isolated from national development, and many of them are also geographically isolated and completely lack access to education, information, and life skills training. So the key gender-based challenges, obviously some of these would be familiar across the sort of developing world, but there's a couple that I want to highlight today, and particularly is the lack of education and life skill training, because that means that women are ill-equipped to be part of the formal workforce. They have little or no decision-making control, and access to productive resources is limited, and they are socially and culturally prevented from leaving their home or participating in labor outside of the farm or the family home. Therefore, women's employment tends to be in the informal sector, particularly in agrarian or small home-based enterprises. And I think there's a whole narrative in Pakistan about agriculture being the prime resource of employment, but I've been researching a lot, and I was talking to some people yesterday about how there's a data paucity. But basically, it seems that 72% of all employment in Pakistan is actually outside of agriculture. And within this informal employment, 65% are women and girls. So stereotyping of women is obviously an important barrier that prevents their development. And I kind of want to put this in the context of right now and today. So I don't know, I mean, International Women's Day, there's always the Women's March, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pakistani politics or follow what's happening there. So we have our own version of this. We've had radical feminism in the country since the 1970s, and definitely in the early 80s, women took to the streets. So it's always been there, but over the last 2 or 3 years, a new wave of feminists, the young feminists, have kind of come out on the streets, and they want to celebrate International Women's Day in the form of this march called Aurat March. Aurat means woman. And it's been a really, really interesting exercise because it kind of exposes the kind of barriers they've had to face. Just to give you an example, there was a petition in the Lahore court. Lahore is our second largest city. I'm from Karachi, the largest. So there was a petition saying that women should not be allowed to march because it will disrupt and corrupt family values. Similarly, in Karachi right now, there's a threat from 10 religious parties who've gone to the court saying women should not be allowed to march because this will completely subvert us as a culture. So basically, women emerging as leaders and as agents of change, and I'm talking specifically about Lahore and Karachi because these are our most modern and progressive cities, are still not an accepted value in society. But I suppose some of this would be what you would have expected. But what is less in the news and what is often missing in the conversation is our young people, who we unflatteringly refer to as our youth bulge. Not kind. But 64% of our population is under the age of 30. We have thousands and thousands of skilled and intelligent women who we're underutilizing. Technology is now emerging as a grand solution. And there is a growing market and awareness for craft and skills that we have conventionally overlooked. So lots has changed in the last couple of decades. So despite our gloomy image, I just wanted to show you a pretty part of Pakistan and leave you with this. Yeah, this is the north of the country. I promise, all of it looks like this. Come over. No, no. Well, some of it looks like this. That's the important part. But yeah, Pakistan has a lot to offer, and I don't think these are the images people think of when they first think about the country. Not at all. Well, I hope we're changing that a little bit today. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that many, many, many women have the potential to become successful creators, entrepreneurs, and leaders. But creative businesses in particular struggle to connect with markets and to earn a decent living, which means that most traditional makers live in abject poverty. And it's always bothered me in particular that a country like ours, which prides itself on its rich cultural heritage, and where 15% of our 250 million people are actually employed by craft directly, the people who create the physical manifestation of this culture that we take so much pride in cannot afford to feed their children. So something has to change, right? But it is a very, very hard time right now to be working on artisan rights, particularly in the context of cultural and intellectual property. Cheap mass production is on the rise. If we could outsource our souls to China, we would. I mean, we're close. But I mean, there's definitely an industry-led well, yeah, that's not a great model either. They're suffering. But yeah, industry-led development agenda. There are shrinking incomes. Urbanization is on the rise at the cost of local communities. And there is little to no investment in rural economies. So communities are now fragmented, both by distance and changes in lifestyle, which we are very, very ill prepared for. So it is in this context that my work, we try and propagate and scale maker ecologies and explore means of changing craft and industry such that local, small-scale, traditional production can sustain rural communities and also have a low carbon footprint, because that's just how it works. And today's day and age, that is the need of the hour. Obviously, there's a lot of interesting digital and tech-based solutions that are being piloted at the moment, but there is a lot that still needs to be done. So what do? I will be focusing here on the work that I have undertaken as part of the Entrepreneurship and Community Development Institute, which has been working for over 3 decades, particularly with homebound rural communities. So women that cannot leave their home, but have a lot of skill and talent and often need markets to come to them, which is complicated in our sort of Muslim cultural context. And I will also refer in pockets to other projects and initiatives that I have been a part of. So this is what the ECDI does. We've been working on social and economic empowerment since 1990. And as I said, the focus has been poor, sequestered women, refugees, and young people, particularly within the handcrafted fabric sector, but we have worked in other sectors, including seedlings, handmade paper, and others. So these are some of the constraints that we address. Obviously, access to market is a major constraint, particularly for remote rural producers. And we do this through the creation of local leadership. These are chains of women-to-women chains which are culturally appropriate. Because one of the reasons women are not able to interact with markets in our context is that markets are very male-led. And in conservative Muslim cultures, women are not meant to interact with men from outside the family, which obviously completely makes a buyer-seller or a trading relationship really, really complex. And so we have created chains of 22 women. So at no point do women need to interact with men. They just get to the market using other women and groups of women. The other large constraint is the access to business development services, because there is little to no upskilling available for producers, and we try and address this through training. Finally, and this is kind of the crux of our work, we try and create what we call pro-poor market channels, which means that we're looking at social needs and not just economic needs. So this is done through the creation of what we hope are sustainable market linkages with mainstream retailers. Over the last 3 decades, ECDI has worked with 30,000 producers, including 22,000 embroiderers and over 500 sales agents. These sales agents are all women leaders. So what we try and do is we modernize products and skill sets and offer an efficient production or value chain while simultaneously training small producers to utilize market mechanism in a way that makes sense to them. And this enables them to connect with mainstream markets such that their skill sets become a reliable source of income for them. A key element, obviously, of this work is business design training, which enables them to run productive enterprises. But also a very important and I think related facet is that while colors, patterns, and other techniques that represent skills that have been passed through generation to generation are very important, we've needed to focus very strongly on product innovation to ensure the survival of traditional techniques. This is due to the rapidly changing consumer tastes, which necessitate continuous design intervention. And obviously, leadership development has been essential for the local institutionalization of access to and greater resources. So a critical link, as I said, is the creation of access to market. And while technology is important here, equally important is the process of self-actualization and creation of local pools of support and women's leadership. So this can look quite different. That was, the first picture was a picture inside in Karachi. This is a picture in Chitral. So it can look quite different based on context, rural versus urban. And even within Pakistan, the needs and the methodologies can change quite drastically as we move from region to region. So everything that we do is very, very context-based. So modernizing craft is kind of essential in our context to make it relevant as well as desirable. So we use heritage skills. Sorry, let's just go back there. Okay. We use heritage skills to develop campaigns to try and change consumer mindsets, to take more pride in local handmade items. So our model is pretty simple. We support access to a mainstream national and international marketplace through design training, which focuses on quality, on concept, on material and innovation and much more, as well as business training, which is a range of modules ranging from pricing, negotiation, budgeting, and marketing. And again, some of these trainings are entirely pictorial because the communities that we're dealing with are not, have never been to school. So yeah, I spoke earlier about technology, and I think it's really interesting in the Pakistani context right now with the government rolling out massive programs such as Digital Pakistan and Ehsaas and all of that. So behind all of that is the fact that Pakistan now has 4G, and we have it pretty extensively across the country. Mobile penetration is estimated at 75%. Although I will counter this with a few recent studies that have indicated a strong gender bias in both access to smartphones and the internet, which is still viewed as a potential source of corruption of values, particularly when women and girls have access. But equally, the cost of smartphones is still fairly prohibitive, but most people do have phones, so they have access to calls and text, and that enables us to use WhatsApp and simpler methodologies at least. WhatsApp voice notes are probably the most groundbreaking tool ever to have been invented because you don't need to do anything except just understand how to basically use the tool. There's a lot of e-commerce ventures emerging, and the growing logistics sector is supporting that. At the moment, Pakistan is operating 90% on cash on delivery because there's still a lack of trust on credit cards, but this is going to change. It's expected to change over the coming years. So I think the question for us is, how do we connect skilled producers and young entrepreneurs so that technology actually helps traditional skills and makers, but also brings craft to markets in a way that is fair for all? And I think the word fair is very, very key here. So our concept, as I said, is simple. We operate in an informal economy where concepts like minimum or fair wage are laughable suggestions, but we try and enforce and train people on this. We try and create capacity that will allow and foster design innovation such that designers, or what is called designers, are embedded or created within craft communities itself. So they don't have to rely on urban or external partners coming from outside to create a new design. I mean, that is how they've operated for thousands of years without any support. So I think what's happened now is that with modern design kind of changing so fast and being so globally interconnected, we're trying to educate local communities on what that might mean. And obviously, as I said, we connect people using simple methods like WhatsApp notes. And when they're ready and possible, we look at tools like Facebook, although there's a lot of cyber harassment, so we have to be particularly careful in our context. And finally, we showcase artisan stories and processes, both contemporary and traditional. So I won't go into too much detail in the model, but basically I think what we try and do is use market-based, very capitalist mechanisms, but nonetheless we don't just try and make, hey, Pakistan is super capitalist, what can you do? But we don't just try and make beautiful products, right? We try and innovate the ecosystem too. We try and shake things up from the grassroots. Fresh product design, as I said, is key to all of this because it has to appeal to modern urban sensibility, but still also incorporate traditional skills. We do engage consultants to improve the quality of craft, but over the years, we no longer work with international consultants at all. And we work with very few urban designers and consultants, and where possible, we use local indigenous experts. And I think that's been just really interesting in the local context for them to look at that traditional model of master apprentice kind of coming back in a way, and it's been deeply appreciated, so we can take expertise from one part of the country to another part of the country to help each other out. Finally, and I think this is kind of the most exciting one, and it's where technology can play a very big role. We're piloting a few things right now, but it's this concept of artisan hub creation and leadership within these, which I think will be the key to success in the future and allow us to work with remote communities in a competitive fashion, which also won't overwhelm them. Because I think the problem with expecting one small unit to produce at scale, they're always going to be there. I think they were beautifully illustrated by the film we just saw. And I think what we're looking at now is this kind of production-based technology, a very simple tool where pools of producers can be producing that 25,000 piece order rather than one community or one producer group being overwhelmed by it. I mean, it's still very much in the pilot stage, so we can't talk to results, but it's something that we're looking at in the future. So here's an image from one of my favorite campaigns that we did a while back. If you're at all familiar with the Pakistani context, you'd know, well, obviously there's a little bit of feminist sloganeering, so on point, so capitalist. Yeah. But yeah, But what you see also in the picture is a traditional ruli. That's the quilt that's handmade, and it's usually made by women sitting together, chatting, having a chai, and it's very much a communal and love-filled activity. They were often made for marriages or for sisters and daughters. It's obviously now a commercial product as well, and a market for it exists. But we've married it to these pop art images, which are obviously digitally printed, of one of our most famous pop singers and divas, Noor Jahan, if anybody might know of her. So this is the kind of campaign that will now appeal to modern consumers. But yeah, so we have a lot of challenges. Obviously, first of all, the biggest issue is that producers are not used to making to scale. So they can make some very, very good samples, but when it comes to producing at scale, they're no longer able to maintain quality. There is a massive issue of copyrights, or what you would call design copying. There's a lack of original ideas and innovation. And I don't think it's because people are deliberately trying to be unoriginal. It's because copying a master was traditionally a way to honor them, and that is how you learned your craft. So originality is not traditionally valued in artisan community, and it is something that they have had to struggle to learn. Finally, skills transfer is a massive issue, with younger generations choosing to opt out, particularly of the skills that are a lot harder to learn. And there is the sense of the pie being really small. So even master trainers fear being crowded out. And I think that needs to change as well if we want that industry to change. And finally, access to artisan groups, particularly women. As I said, in the rural context, 70% of women do not leave their homes. How do you actually get to them when most of them are illiterate and not online? And that is obviously a massive endemic issue in this sector. But there is a role for technological solutions and, I think, culturally appropriate solutions. So we never go into a community with a cultural change message. We always go in with an economic message or a craft-based message. And I find that over time that results in better gender dividends than going in and saying, right, this way you're operating is not okay. I mean, and obviously there are massive, I think even more than the artisan level, the sectoral challenges are huge. Nothing new has happened in the last 2 decades. I've been working in the sector for 12 years. It's the same ideas that people keep regurgitating. They just find new donor agencies to finance them, and nothing really exciting is happening. And even within these kind of like projects or programs, there is very little coordination, no sharing of resources, definitely no sharing of ideas or data. And as a result, even very, very talented craftspeople struggle to make a living. And this is made worse in recent years by lack of investment in the sector and by inflation. And as a result, products made in Pakistan that could benefit from the mainstream local as well as international markets don't actually make it to market. And when they do, there are inadequate payment gateways, very poor logistic services. And as a result, craftspeople supply to low-value markets, often their own local kind of like community-based markets. Mainstream retailers consider them dated and don't want to work with them. And they are kind of left in this cycle of vicious poverty. So I'm going to tell you guys a little story about one of my absolute favorite women in the whole world. Her name is Jamila. She's a traditional Baloch woman who migrated to Karachi many years ago when she got married. She has 4 daughters and 2 sons, which is fairly typical of a family size, even if you're in the urban areas. I met Jamila working in 2012 on a USAID project that was, looking at women's entrepreneurship. And at that time, she was doing some very low value piecework for, oops, we have to go back to Jamila. Oh no, we're moving forward. Can we go back to Jamila, please? Yeah, I did. Okay, great. So she was doing that work, and she lives in what we call rural Karachi. Karachi is massive. I mean, we've got 25 million people in that city, just for context. But she lives about an hour and a half outside the city center in a very underdeveloped part of the city. And when she first started coming out and, doing commissioned work, as well as taking work back for other homebound women in her community who were not allowed to leave their homes, basically emerging as a leader in her community, she was severely maligned and ridiculed. The leaders in that community told her husband to divorce her. People told her that nobody would marry her daughters. Basically, she was a perfect example of a bad woman, a woman who leaves her home. Fast forward, and I'm not going to go into the whole story because it always makes me cry a little bit, but fast forward to last December, just now, 2 months ago, there was a large festival that I was involved with, a feminist festival, and one of the streams that we had done, which I was really excited about, was trying to get young, urban, hip millennials to come and craft with traditional women and to make this communal quilt. And Jamila was leading on that activity. And it was so interesting because that same man, that same tribal leader who'd asked her husband to leave her in 2013 and for the whole community to not eat in her home, to nobody to marry her daughters, all of that, she brought him to the festival. And mind you, this is a hardcore feminist festival in the Pakistani context. She'd brought him with her and she'd said, I want to show him who I am. And it was such a story of empowerment. So if you look at it, it's not a large number of years. We first met 8 years ago in about 7, 8 years. She had managed to change the narrative, to take complete ownership of her lives. Her daughters are all educated. One of them teaches in a, reasonably sort of upper class school. She's an English teacher. I mean, the kind of impact that just craft or working with craft and working with her community had on her life is something that we would like to see scaling. Sorry, can we go one slide back? Yeah. Yeah. So my question is, how do we foster more Jamilas? How do we have so many of these success stories? With the economic downturn, inflation, general lack of respect for women, deep-rooted misogyny, as well as what I would like to call a greed-driven consumer culture where we just buy these mass-produced products because they're considered modern, and we reject cultural wear as dated. How do we persuade people to then buy local, support livelihoods, and in doing so, create space for women like Jamilas, who are natural readers, while also reducing our carbon footprint? This should not be such a hard sell, but sadly, it is. So, what do we really want? Obviously, we want people to stop letting their consumption fever get better of them. and to stop eroding what is really unique about being Pakistani in this world and destroying all artisanal skills and the thousands of communities that sustain them. And this is the most depressing part. These communities are starving, are quite literally starving, because it's not like they have other skill sets so that they can hop on to another part of the economy. So we need to be starting to support these enterprises in a way that is ethical and enables them to emerge as leaders. Because, and this is just what I think maybe, but in a mass-produced global world, the true luxury and what makes each one of us individual and special is handcrafted and indigenous and heritage. And it brings voice and recognition and self-sufficiency to disadvantaged groups, and in my line of work, particularly women. All of these products have been designed and made by local communities and are probably not what you think of when you first think of Pakistani craft. So if everyone started thinking about the environment, about fellow human beings, about treating each other better, and just creating space for 15% of our population, which is our traditional communities, we could be very easily looking at this green, more inclusive future, and dare I say it, more feminist future that, you know, the government keeps talking about through various programs like Digital Pakistan. And obviously with International Women's Day around the corner, and coming from a city where we've seen tragedies like, you know, the Baldia fire in Karachi, everybody is much more familiar with the Rana Plaza incident in Bangladesh, but there was a similar, very horrific fire in Karachi as well. I think there is a strong sense within maker communities and I think activist communities that this is not a future that we are aligned to, and this is not what we want Pakistan to become. Where images like these are the norm, that this is everywhere, and this is that what we're okay with. Because remember the other pretty part of Pakistan I showed you? Yeah, we wanted to still keep looking like that. So we're slowly coming to the understanding that the way we make has to change. And not just because it's a fad, because I mean, I agree, we can all safely roll our eyes when Levi's launches a marketing campaign saying Levi's craftwork to make the world's most mass-produced item. But the idea that a craftsperson and is a change maker and a leader is an important one and has been a part of our culture before. And we need to move back to a time where this was not as binary and segmented. Because heritage skills are our cultural capital, and therefore what happened to fast food needs to happen to fast fashion. We need to make it very undesirable, very uncool, and something that we wouldn't confess publicly to doing. So because, you know, we all heard the adage that fast fashion isn't cheap, someone is paying, and this is what that someone looks like, right? This woman's story is also equally incredible. She's one of the last people in a community that makes a particular kind of hand-woven thread. And that's my team talking to her, and it's so sad because in certain markets abroad that kind of product or that kind of story should be able to sell. And we're not even talking about mass production here. We're just talking about a dying skill and a dying art which uses organic dyes and natural wools to make product. So I guess the question that we grapple with is, how do we ensure that our future is brighter than it is today? And how do we ensure that we're taking all these makers with us? Because another statistic, I mean, I love them when I can find them, which is that Pakistan has 20 million home-based workers, of which 12 million are women. And that's an example of a home-based worker, right? And a recent UN report suggests that there is economic value to this, right? So because everybody loves it when things have economic value. So this sector is valued at 400 billion rupees. And as a result, I really do think that overlooking the creative economy, which is craft, fashion, art, whatever you want to call it, is overlooking a potential for inclusive growth by using the skills and capacities of all of these people, particularly young people in underserved female communities. So how do we go back and yet move forward without making the same mistakes? So I'll just share some learnings that ECDI has had over the last 3 decades. Right. Okay. Yeah. So obviously, we know that our female-led leadership model works because incomes are raised, new producers are attracted, and women report higher levels of gender autonomy. But access to real high-value markets is still very tricky because artisans do not have the knowledge is required. They don't know how to scale. Finance is a massive issue. There is little or no access, as I said, to business development services, which increases the sort of artisan dependence on development aid projects because it's only when you have the project that you're able to supply whatever their business needs are. But for me, I think one of the most critical things, and the reason we've been successful at all, is that all of our work starts with an understanding that you need to have a rights-based approach. And allow for all kinds of diversity of voices and experiences. And I think sometimes that means that we've had to redesign projects just after launching them, and that's fine, because if the whole point is to promote artisan or women's voice and leadership and control, then you can't take that control away from them at the beginning of the project. It has to be there from the get-go. And finally, as I said, I think what people need to understand is that craft is a particularly complicated value chain. There are so many actors and agents that are involved. And as I said, in the Pakistani context, the fact that many of our producers are actually completely segregated from society is also something that we have to take into account. And that is just part of their culture. And until they are ready to change that part, which doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon, it just has to be an accepted way of working with them. This is not a reason to ignore or neglect them. And you can't leave like 15% of your population and say, right, they can just stay at home. So finally, this is a slide that I've borrowed from Fashion Revolution, which I just love as a movement, and I think it's fantastic. But essentially, I think, yeah, the time for a revolution has come. And I think most of us, and it's really interesting to me when and not just here, this is not a comment on anybody in this room, but generally, even within Pakistan, when I go to development conferences, we don't really have craft conferences, which is why I love this one so much. But we do have a lot of, sort of development conferences. Even people who've been working in the craft economy in different ways don't actually dress like they do, right? They'll all turn up in their latest H&M and Zara's, and that's just shocking to me, because you need to dress on the outside so that people can tell what you actually care about in the inside, right? That you care about people who you work with, that you care about culture, you care about craft, and you care about the environment, and it's not just for your slides. Because the revolution, with all its lovely feminist and maker overtone, it awaits you. It really does. Thank you.